Hello, and welcome back to the Mental Cartographer. I'm your host Dain, and today we're going to be talking about something that could be unsettling and could divide people. Is violence a survival strategy? Now, contrary to the topics that we are going to be talking about, I am very unfortunately going to have to speak a little quieter today because there is a tutorial going on next door, and I worry that they're just going to be listening to me talk about people killing each other while they do. I don't know what they do. They might be doing some maths. Anyway, let's move on. Violence. I don't mean that in some dramatic Hollywood action movie kind of way. I mean that in a biological, evolutionary sense. Because violence isn't random. If it were, we wouldn't be seeing the same patterns of aggression, dominance, and competition across human history, across cultures, and even across species. So the question isn't really why people commit violence. We already know that it's a mix of biological and environmental factors. The real question is, does it work? From an evolutionary perspective, the answer to why people commit crimes is quite simple. There are resources. There's food, territory, money, power, reproductive opportunities. Whatever people want, they have two ways of getting it. They can play by the rules, or they can just flout them all and take it all. Now, obviously, not every violent act is about gaining something, but when we step back and look at the patterns of violence, a lot of them fit into a larger strategic framework. Take gang violence, for example. A drive-by shooting might seem chaotic and senseless at first, but when you see that's about territory, power, and control, it starts making sense. It's a signal. We run this place. Step out of line, and there are going to be consequences. And in environments where state enforcement is weak, or trust in institutions is low, that kind of dominance really works. It's an alternative system of control. There's this idea of the selfish gene. This is the idea that genes don't care about morality, justice, or fairness. They only care about what gets passed on. If aggression, manipulation, or even deception helps that happen, then obviously those traits are going to stick around. But you might be thinking, cheaters and aggressors, they usually get caught, right? Well, not always. In fact, one of the most successful survival strategies isn't just violence, it's mobility. If someone cheats, steals, or manipulates in one place, and then move on, then they may be able to move further before the consequences even catch up. That's why we can see lifelong con artists, repeat offenders, and people who seem to escape consequences over and over. In a society built on trust, it actually caters specifically to these kinds of people. A small percentage of cheaters can actually thrive. Many cultural factors also play a part in this. One very extreme example is the Yanomamo Indians. They live in a resource-rich area, and their culture embraces aggression. In fact, 44%, almost half, of all Yanomamo men over 20 have killed someone. You walk into the street, 1 in 2 people have murdered someone. But here's the really wild part. The men who kill more actually have more wives and more children than those who don't. On average, 1.63 wives and 4.91 children for killers versus 0.63 wives and 1.59 children for non-killers. Is this just a correlation? Violence isn't something that just happens, it's an advantage in this case. It leads to more reproductive success, more influence, and more control. And that raises an even bigger question. How much of the violence we see in modern societies is just a mismatch between our instincts and our current environment? Now, what about violence in reproductive strategies? The stats show that rapists tend to target individuals who show signs of fertility, like a low waist-to-hip ratio, which is linked to reproductive success. And men are usually more distressed by sexual infidelity than emotional infidelity, while for women, it's the opposite. And while men often use physical dominance, women tend to compete socially and psychologically. Obviously, I'm not grouping everyone into these two categories, but the statistics show that these are actually the general trends. All of these behaviors, whether physical or social aggression, aren't just random outbursts, this means. They're strategies. They're honed by evolution, and they either succeed or fail, just depending on the environments around them. I remember when I first read about all of this, I couldn't put the article down for a second. So stay tuned and I'll be right back with more stuff. Hello, we are back. We are so back with part 2. Let's talk biology. One thing you may not have known before is that violent criminals actually tend to have lower resting heart rates. The literal beating of the heart is different. Why does that matter? A lower heart rate usually also means a lower fear response. Less fear then can equate to higher risk-taking, and higher risk-taking, in turn, can literally just mean more aggressive behavior. And this pattern isn't just in humans, it's across the entire animal kingdom. Dominant, aggressive individuals tend to have lower resting heart rates, suggesting that fearlessness itself may be an evolutionary advantage in some contexts. And the manifestation of this fearlessness could be through violence. And this, makes complete sense. If someone doesn't feel fear, they're more likely to take risks, fight, steal, and challenge authority. However, there are still a few different theories on why lower heart rates may be linked to crime. The most obvious theory would probably be the fearlessness hypothesis. If your body doesn't respond to threats like most people's, you're naturally more likely to take risks, even ones that could land you in prison. Another could be the stimulation-seeking hypothesis. Some people have a naturally lower level of physiological arousal, so they seek out high-risk, high-adrenaline activities to compensate, to fill that little hole in their hearts. And another reason could be the empathy deficit hypothesis. Lower arousal levels could mean a reduced ability to emotionally respond to the suffering of others, making acts of violence or manipulation easier to carry out. They might like it. So in a way, some people are literally just biologically predisposed to be less concerned with the consequences. They don't feel anxious about getting caught, and they don't get the same emotional response from seeing others in distress. When placed in a society that values rule abiding, if they literally just do not care about the rules, then the society literally also cannot control them. Now obviously, I'm not saying that everyone with lower resting heart rates become criminals, but there is definitely a link between the two. And here's where it gets even crazier. When we look at brain scans of violent offenders, we do see clear differences. Okay, I'm now going to say a few things that you may not know what's going on, but they will be explained, I promise. Let's start with the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and regulating emotions. It is found that in violent offenders, psychopaths, and repeat criminals, they have reduced activity in this area, leading to 1. Impulsivity, acting without thinking of consequences. 2. Poor emotional regulation, quicker to anger and more likely to lash out. And 3. Risky decision-making, choosing short-term gains over long-term consequences. Now let's compare that to the amygdala. This is the part of the brain that is to do with emotional and fear processing. It is found that in reactive, impulsive murderers, the amygdala is often hyperactive, meaning that they overreact to emotional triggers. Reactive impulsive murderers basically are that someone has done something and therefore the other person reacts to it by murdering. However, in comparison to that, in cold, calculated killers, the amygdala is often underactive, meaning they feel little to no emotion when committing violent acts. Then we also have the striatum. This is a brain region involved in reward seeking and pleasure. Psychopaths usually have an overactive striatum, which could mean that they enjoy risk-taking, thrill-seeking, and even hurting others. Think about that. Hurting others could be a reward for them. So when you put it all together, you get a biological profile of a violent individual. Reduced impulse control, a heightened or dulled emotional response, and an increased drive for stimulation. So, here's something interesting though. Not all crime is violent. We also have white-collar crime. But the evolutionary logic still applies here. Take white-collar criminals such as fraudsters, con artists, financial manipulators. They might not punch someone in the face, and they might not have the means to punch someone in the face and cause damage either, but they still do exploit others for resource. And research shows that these criminals tend to have different neurological profiles than violent offenders. They usually score high on measures of cognitive function. They usually have strong impulse control, strategic thinking, and planning abilities. They have better executive functioning, meaning they can delay gratification and manipulate others without getting caught, and often even higher emotional intelligence, meaning that they can read people well and use that to their advantage. Now, all three of these can be someone completely nice. I mean, higher cognitive function, higher executive function, and higher emotional intelligence. This could be someone that you'd want to have in your life. This could be someone who's smart and also can read others well. But these could also be the makings of a white-collar criminal. Basically, white-collar criminals are playing the same survival game as violent criminals, but they're just using a different toolset. Instead of fists and weapons, they use deception and manipulation. And in some ways, this can even be more effective. I mean, while violent criminals risk getting caught immediately, white-collar criminals can often operate under the radar for years. This other toolset can also be used in other situations. If violence and manipulation are survival strategies, then it makes sense that we don't only see them in criminals, but also in leaders. History backs this up. The most successful political figures, warlords, and corporate leaders often have traits that overlap with psychopathy. These are high confidence and dominance, lack of empathy for others, ability to manipulate people to get what they want, and the willingness to break moral or ethical rules to gain power. And when we look at modern politics, business, and even entertainment, we can see this pattern playing out over and over. All in all, aggression isn't just physical violence, it can also be social, psychological, or economic. And if the conditions are right, those who are willing to be ruthless often end up at the top. So, after all of this, can we really eliminate violence from human behavior? The answer is definitely no, but we can change how it plays out. Because while violence itself might not go away, the forms it takes can change depending on society and culture. We've already seen this throughout history. Thousands of years ago, conflicts were settled with brute force. Wars, duels, executions. Then came legal systems, redirecting violence into controlled punishment. And now we can see violence playing out in different ways. Corporate competitions, psychological warfare, financial exploitation. So instead of asking, can we get rid of violence? Maybe the real question is, how do we steer aggression towards something productive? Because at the end of the day, aggression isn't always a bad thing. It drives ambition, resilience, and innovation. It's just that when it turns into destruction and exploitation, that's when it becomes a problem. So, is violence a survival strategy? Based on what I know, I would say 100% yes, violence is a survival strategy. That's all we have for today, but I absolutely love this topic, so I am definitely coming back to this next time. So stay tuned until then, and then you'll hear more. I'll see you next time.